Good morning. Thanks for coming out. My name's Trey Ford. I'm the Global Security Strategist with Rapid7. We're here to talk a little bit about scanning the internet. Who here is familiar with Project Sonar? Got a couple of hands, a couple of big smiles, and a hot mic. For those of you that aren't familiar with Project Sonar, this is effectively an extension of scans.io. What we're doing is scanning the entire internet. How many of you guys like exploring? Like to go out and see things, like to travel, like to backpack, like to camp? This is a little bit different, whereas we're looking into the internet. We're looking across the internet to see what there is to see. The first question you want to ask is, why scan? And we get this a lot. A lot of times we get this from people we're scanning. A lot of times we get this from law enforcement. Why is that funny? Pointedly, when we take a look at where we've come in terms of vulnerability research and discovery, I think this has come from a place where it's been limited by interest, by time, or by contract, or distraction. How many of you guys have done research and parked it, left it behind, got distracted, got busy, and left it behind? Scanning the internet takes a lot of time, takes a lot of resources, takes a lot of energy. I would look at the scanning data set from Project Sonar in two distinct ways. One, mapping attack surface that organizations or individuals have co-opted, either purposely or intentionally, or unknowingly, into their environments. How many of you guys have smart DVRs or like ATT Uverse, those sorts of devices streaming over the internet, your TV and cable? Do you consider those devices dual-homed? Do you know exactly what they're listening to on the internet? I think there's a fair amount of stuff that we bring into our life that we don't know about. The other way to look at this data set is discovering bad actors, specifically what hosts and services they're using and where those things are moving. Finally, why scan the internet? It's so that you don't have to. There's a lot of things that go into this, from a scalability, from a communications standpoint, from a response standpoint. There's a lot of things that we discover that are unexpectedly vulnerable or weak or do not scale. And there's a lot of correspondence, a lot of communications, escalated communications, about why the scanning is taking place, why you knocked out DNS, why you knocked out different services. So what's different about this? And there are a lot of organizations that have done this. The Internet Census, you guys are familiar with Shodan. A lot of other platforms doing this sort of testing. The difference here is that we make this data available to you. It's freely available, in full, all of it. You can pull this down and tear into this. What data is available? For those of you interested, starting off, the entire data set's about 3.5 terabytes. It's generated 4 to 5 days a week, and we're tracking, if you decompress that, about 12 terabytes. Now, all of this is going to be zipped up in a specific way. The reason why it's zipped is, for the most part, depending on how you're doing your computing, your I/O speeds may be faster than your read-write. You may be actually able to process this, unzip it, process it, and pull what you need faster than you can lift it off the disk after unzipping it. The way that we approach this, we have about a 5 terabyte optimized database. And if you want to pare it down a little bit for your environment, the last 90 days data will fit into about a 300 gigabyte database. So what's available? There's some obvious things. We're scanning about 20 ports. It starts with port 443. We've got regular TCP, HTTP. We're collecting the SSL certificates. Other SSL places, so places where you'll see like IMAP and other services start TLS, we're capturing all of that data. Now, DNS is interesting because you can get at any request. You can capture all of the information from a standard DNS request. But the reverse is where things get interesting. You may go into an organization and perform standard DNS lookups, and they're going to have 30 or 40 servers prepared to load balance that and make that available to you. If you turn around and say, okay, if I'm going to increment through, give me address 1, address 2, address 3, we unintentionally discovered a lot of organizations that were running stateful packet inspection firewalls. Any idea what happens when you start scanning a whole bunch of IPs through reverse lookups? It's not a DNS issue, it's a state table issue. And then you've knocked entire data centers offline from this direction. So special quick apologies to Amazon. They've been very thoughtful. We do a lot of scanning from there. Finally, one of the common questions we're going to get is, why only 20 ports? Any of you guys thinking that yet? Why 20 ports? There are 65,000 ports. Why would we only scan 20 ports? Well, we'd start off with what's meaningful. Of 65,000 ports, there's a lot of meaningless ports, a lot of redirect ports. But when we start looking at core interesting data sets, The obvious starts with HTTP. Obviously, SSL is terribly interesting. A lot of UDP stuff, and this is where we start getting interested in what else there is. So the way that we do this, and we'll do this periodically, we'll take all 65,000 ports, and we'll scan them across 1 million randomly selected nodes, stack rank them, and find out what's interesting, and prioritize those for the next wave of scans. What else is interesting about this data? We have the ability and the infrastructure to generate large volumes of scan data. If we were to scan all 65,000 ports, if you say average of about 3 hours a scan, that's going to be about 10 a.m. on the 22nd day before we finish one scan pass. Not efficient, not useful. So what we've tried to do is prioritize this. And if you look at the data sets, if you look at port 443 with 40 million ports open, that's 25 million SSL certs, and we're getting 55 gigs of data in about 4 hours. Now, if you look at HTTP GET down at the bottom, 1.5 terabytes with 200 million entries. Now, this is happening frequently. Again, these scans are running 4 or 5 days a week. All this data is available to you. Now, one of the most interesting things we get into when we start talking about how to partner with vulnerability researchers is this discussion around what is the scope? What does this mean? Anytime you have a discussion with the press or with your PR team about what does this vulnerability mean? What have I found? How big a deal is it? The only way to get a notion of scope is to go out and test for it. Now, making the assumption all these hosts, all these nodes will be connected to the internet. The recent gas pump vulnerability, I'm sure you guys saw it in the news. When we first spoke with a researcher, he assumed this was going to be pretty prevalent and it's going to affect all systems exposed to the internet that ran the software. In reality, having done the quick test, we came back with about 3%. What's magical about this is we provide this infrastructure and do this sort of scanning for all kinds of researchers, whether they're academics, full-time researchers, hobbyists, or I think we even did a little bit of work for Kaspersky in 2013. I purposely excluded the legend from this graph. Any idea what this is? Did you guys get coffee at the last break? So if we're only scanning 20 ports, and let me assure you, there are more than 20 lines on this graph, what you're looking at is unique fingerprints for different services being offered over these ports. A lot of questions come to mind, and if you're anything like me, you're focusing on what my red dot isn't going to show, but this red line arcing out of nowhere, I'm sure you're looking at this. Why do you think that is? What is it? Where did it come from? What do we know about it? Project Sonar was designed to try to be made available to the entire research community, to answer questions and give you the ability to get insight into information you couldn't replicate on your own. The work factor involved in generating this kind of data is extremely complicated, extremely difficult, and there's a lot of communications that have to happen. This data is yours. I can tell you that we're sitting on roughly 50 ODA right now that we know of that we don't have time to go in and investigate. When you start tearing apart the internet and looking at this, there's a couple observations I think that non-technical people can look at. Somebody somewhere, some organization has done a great deal of negotiation and contract work to deploy this. Whatever this is, it started and it's on a rocket ship trajectory. I don't imagine that's going to diminish quite as quickly. Things don't seem to sunset that quickly on the internet. Think about how much vulnerable SQL is still out there, Microsoft SQL. That stuff hasn't been sunset. Windows XP will be the same. This right here, this is going to be everywhere. So the question I want to challenge you with is, if you had the ability to go in and work on these fingerprints, tighten these things up, and identify what this device is, do you want to make any bets about how secure this is? How much testing this has undergone? I think we all agree it's probably not going to have seen much scrutiny, much review, but this is publicly accessible. We see so many systems that drop right to a command prompt, right to a root shell, or have absolutely no notion of authentication or authorization. Fingerprinting is absolutely critical, and of course there's more devices than we have manpower to attack. So one of the products we've built is Recog, which is a recognition engine that lives underneath Project Sonar. What this does, it's a lot like an in-map fingerprint if you want to think of it in that framework. It identifies products, services, operating systems, and hardware. The idea is you can match these fingerprints. What we need is manpower to help us process this. It's out there on GitHub. The deck won't have clickable links, but you should be able to copy paste them straight out. And we're working on a visual simplified workflow that's in the works. The idea is go in, dig through the data, identify this stuff. Any bets on whether or not you could get a Black Hat or DEF CON talk, 44Con talk accepted when you find a bunch of ODE in this red line? It's a slam dunk. It's there. Go get it. The biggest ask I'll have for you is to jump in and help us out with this. One of the other fun things that happens when you go out and scan the entire internet is you identify structure and you identify randomness. We know that there are roughly 12.8 million SSH keys on the internet. And we know roughly half of those are unique. How does that make you feel? Really bad. Dan Kaminsky said something really funny the other day about math. You could be really good at math, and I imagine that sets a certain lens because you're focused on a certain problem. What I like about this is the observation that SSH keys, host keys, when you first connect, are supposed to be unique. What do you know about a non-unique SSH host key? Say it louder. Someone else has the same private key for that machine. That's a bad thing. We also know of 2 unique ISPs that have each their own SSH ID, their SSH key, that's on 320,000 nodes. And it's been in use for the last 6 to 10 years. That's well over 250,000, that's 1/3 of a million devices that all you have to do is go find out what that device is and play with it, and you're home free. What we live with today, and this isn't to talk about the Internet of Things, but what we're looking at today, the safety of our systems, the safety of our home networks, the safety of our data centers, is tied to our neighbors. Understanding what else is on the internet. When you look at IPMI, when you look at all of these remote access systems, when you look at devices inside of your home network that are now going to live in the same segment as your work machines, that's an amazing attack surface. This is neighborhood watch for the internet, but we need help. You guys want to jump in and play a little bit with the data? Yes. Who should we pick on? I mean, .ir, .sy, .nsa are always fun. I was picking on Veracode a moment ago. So what I'm jumping into here is a search interface. It's in beta. We're working on getting this prepared to scale out. What we're basically looking at, it's the same data sets we just spoke about, is the kinds of data that you can pull. So IPs to domain, down a little bit further, domain to reverse DNS, and then domains to certificates. Now, if I were to take any one of these certificates, we go take a look and see what other domains will be tied to it. While that's loading, I need a domain to pick on. You're hesitating this long. You're not thinking Veracode. I could pick on Chris Ng. We could pick on Kaspersky. Where do you want to go? Who? IRS.gov? They secure our data. So looking through IPs to domain, this is basically every data from, or this is a query through, I believe, just the last 90 days of data from Sonar. Now this project is done with University of Michigan and their ZMAP utility, so all this data is available on scans.io. Just to make this visible, everything you want is here, it's downloadable. Looking for anything interesting or out of place. Domain to reverse DNS. Creds. Fire.test. What are you? HTTP references to domains. So this starts to show relationships to external domains, which was kind of fun. Mr. Ng didn't necessarily enjoy me tearing apart his Veracode environment. Go for it? All right. all in one place. Domains and certificates. So these 3 certs are tied to this domain, and they look fairly specific. Spam1, MX5, mobile web varicode. If you've done any sort of standard open source intelligence or fingerprinting, this is going to look very familiar, but not as cool looking as in Maltego. I think that'd be a worthwhile uptake. The trouble is I don't think Maltego likes to digest hundreds of gigs at a time. Spam1, MX5. What are all these individual IDs? I guess they're just tied directly to load balancer, yeah, IP. Sorry? Yeah. E-learning varicode, info varicode, gems, that's all good stuff. Transfer.varicode.com. Now, what's this cybersecurity law blog? Who are you guys talking to, and why aren't you working with me on that stuff? So this is fairly simplistic at a high level. Let's talk a little bit about what we can do with this data. When you start looking into domain relationships, when you start seeing what domains or what certificates have been registered, what non-production ready systems have been placed out there, how many of you guys have discovered marketing websites that have been spun up or shadow IT in your environment? The nice thing about working in IT is that people come to work in IT, they work for your organization, and they don't leave, right? They come in, they join, and then they retire, like they always have in the workforce. We find a lot, we find this even at Rapid7. A developer will have taken his Amex, his corporate card, spun up an instance, spun up a Linode, done some work. He's got DNS pointers, he's got it tied in somehow, and then leaves, and it's an abandoned instance that's tied to our infrastructure, and we have no idea about it. From a marketing standpoint, you will very frequently find, interesting from an intelligence standpoint, relationships between companies. You'll find new product lines, product releases that haven't yet been announced, haven't gone live, that are embargoed. There's all kinds of fun information from that perspective. One of the things I'd really like to dive into would be looking for things that live on Tor that have been dual homed, that have been identified here. Now, there's a lot of work trying to identify what's underneath there, but I think there's going to be a fair amount of misconfiguration. We saw some of this when they talked about the Silk Road configuration. I would like to tear into some of that as well. Any questions or thoughts, or I would love to hear about how you guys are using this data, if you are. Go ahead.
So I'll be speaking later, not the next one, but the one after that. I was following because this data is incredibly valuable. The way that we use it in Passive Total is we collect all the certificates. We've processed the stuff from Scans.io into Elasticsearch, and we were making additional pivot points based on certificates we treated the certificates as kind of a way to enrich IP addresses, so that IP addresses, you don't have who is or stuff like that. So having a certificate then ties it to additional domains that may not be overlapping from the passive DNS side of it. So that's how we used it. And there were a couple, I think, cyber espionage-based groups that we had found additional architecture that there was no linkage, and it was only because they shared that certificate that we were able to find that.
Where are you sourcing that data from?
What do you mean?
Your collection of the certificates that are you pulling?
So we had our own. We were collecting certificates on our own as well, but then we just drawed in the Sonar data and just did standard links.
I wonder how much that stuff varies based upon region, where you've crawled it from and gathered it from.
Yeah, well, I'll go into a little bit about that, because I mean, the same thing happens where you source it from the DNS side as well. If you're actively doing sort of DNS resolutions and you're recording that information, like time is skewed, which DNS server you hit becomes incredibly important. Right. So there's a number of different things that start to mess with that process.
Thank you. Other questions? I put the graph back up while you're going to Billy. A conversation I had a couple nights ago with Dan Kaminsky. He reminded me of a challenge he once talked about, how as an industry we need to be looking for the 1,000 most important lines of code. And what's that? 1 million. 1 million. 1 million. lines of code. What I think about that is how to arrive there. How do you pick those out? I mean, we've looked exhaustively, I hope, at open source libraries. But how do we arrive at what else is interesting? And I keep coming back to this graph. What I find terribly interesting about this is we have an idea of now the prevalence of different types of services that we have access to. What we don't have clarity on is the legality of how to interact with those things, what kind of testing we can and can't do. What you do know is that 40 milliseconds in either direction from wherever you live is the rest of the planet. Other organizations, other countries that don't abide by the laws for research and or weaponization of this stuff. And I think this is a first major step in showing, as a community, as a profession, we have the ability to identify this data, work together to fingerprint it, understand it, and then to work to communicate those vulnerabilities. Understand that right now, in this moment, we're at a point in time where whether you're in Europe or in the United States, you're not sure if it's legal or safe to do a notification or a bounty contact for someone outside of your country. Scary times. Go ahead, Billy.
Yeah, I've actually been using this data for a long time, mainly the HTTP stuff. It's about a 70 gig download, and if you uncompress it, it comes out to about like 220 gigs. But the thing that I like the most about it is, number one, I don't have to actually go out and touch devices on the internet, because for some reason people get scared when you do that. And so you can do a lot of testing in-house without ever sending a packet on the network. But also, there's a lot of places that are interested in writing signatures for like detecting IoT devices and refrigerators and stuff like that. And so whenever we write a signature for something like that, you can actually test it against this data set. And if it's not a good signature, since you're kind of simulating a scan against the internet, if you have false positives or it doesn't detect it correctly, this is a great way to see whether or not your code will work at internet scale, right? And so that's kind of hard to replicate unless you have a database like this.
One of the things I push you to check out, have you looked at Recog yet? Check out Recog. So this has, in a couple of areas like SNMP, some of the largest data sets for lookups and fingerprinting. And we've got information here on how to submit to this. So making this accessible, we'll integrate it into the scans. So we can do all the scanning and lookup for you. Inside of the GitHub repository is a pretty good breakdown on how to do analysis on the data set and how to make it more accessible. And have you looked at DAP? Take a hard look at DAP. This is the data analysis pipeline. This basically does everything you're going to need to do while not unzipping the whole thing. So it can be done all in memory. You can scale this across cores, pull it down, and it's designed to be modular, so it's not terribly fast. So if you're setting up correctly, you can run this across a number of cores, do all of that, and get your output fairly quickly. So we're doing a lot of work with University of Michigan to try to make this as accessible as possible. We are working on getting some search nodes on place, and one of the things that we are trying to do is get the Recog Sonar to Recog signature workflow into a simpler process. But please, jump in and use that. We'll do the work for you.